Piracy is Liberation. So, please enjoy.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Well, hello. My name is Markus, Samnell, and I am here to talk about this comic book, Piracy is Liberation. And the reason that I am standing here and not Matthias, there are several different reasons for that. One of them is that I have known Matthias for a very long time, and I've been both a fan and a collaborator with him. So I think I have a pretty good understanding of the themes and issues that he's working with. The first time, let me just first ask, has anyone read this series? Oh. That's good. Because this Piracy is Liberation is quite unique in the Swedish field of comics. I first encountered it in maybe 2006 or something in the library, city library here in Gothenburg. And it struck me as a really old comic to be coming from a Swedish creator, because it's pretty much, it feels pretty un-Swedish in its both form and content. And it has like this, I was kind of struck by the way it resembles a mix of dirty DIY fansign comic art, but with very high production values. It was like glossy paper and good print and everything, and I felt this is really something unique in Sweden. And then a few years later, I got to know Matthias personally, for a complete coincidence, and he has been publishing this series for, I think it's 12 years now, which is also quite different for Swedish comics of this type. And the basic themes of this is like that it's a DIY cyberpunk story, basically, that deals with politics and metaphysics in a setting which is dystopic but still very close to our own world. And it takes place in a future post-apocalyptic society where there only exists one single city called the City, and the setting is quite familiar in the dystopic tradition, as it mixes a bit of 1984 and a bit of Metropolis, and also there you can see like that slogan, the compete, consume, conform. It has it's a reference to the film They Live by
John Carpenter.
Yeah, John Carpenter.
Best film in the world.
Yeah, it's a great film. And I don't know if any more people here have seen that, but it's like basically a film where you put special glasses on and you realize that all the commercial signs are actually projecting slogans like that. And this city has survived some sort of apocalypse, and I won't go in too much into the actual story a little bit, but mostly the concept that he is working with. And anyway, this city exists with no history. The concept of history has become completely eradicated, and information is strictly forbidden, which has created this sort of black market / drug culture around information, because you can plug computers straight into your brain and have an overload of information. And society can best be described as hyper-capitalism mixed with totalitarian state into like this sort of theocracy where consumption and conformity has become a religious duty. So if you to be considered a good citizen, you have a religious duty to consume and comply. And sorry, a shopping temple. working class. This is also in quite an Orwellian tradition, are called slaves, and they're not so much coerced by force, though they are coerced by force as well, but they're also coerced by the basic and totalitarian ideology, commodity and conformity. Another one of the slogans that this super church of capitalism uses is piracy is theft, which is quite obviously the counterpoint of the title of the series. So the whole point of the of the information society thing is that there exists, of course, registers of history, fragments, and so on, of what has come to pass, and the rulers don't want people to have any access to this at all. And in the beginning of the series, we get to follow a pirate who's aptly named Pirate. Everyone has like these code names, and he starts receiving messages that says information wants to be free. And he then starts to pursue this and ends up being jailed, where he meets information, which is another person in the story. So it's a quite literal take of the concept, information wants to be free. But, and from there on, a lot of new characters are being introduced, and it gets into this trapping of a classic small group resisting an evil empire story, which is basically, you can find it in comic books like The Invisibles of Grant Morrison, or the films like The Matrix, or even Star Wars, I suppose. You have to, excuse me, I'm looking at my notes. One of the things that separate this book from the stuff I mentioned earlier, especially like Star Wars and The Matrix, is that these stories dwell on a very open-ended, sort of almost liberal worldview, where freedom is a very loose, it really has no definition. What is freedom? Not being chased by robots, it's a kind of simple analysis. But piracy has a very clear political vision. It comes specifically from an autonomous background, and it was started in 2001 when the autonomous movement still. It was like when it still was. Was it before World Trade Center? And then, so a lot of the things in this series are being or have become quite relevant again. Because you could imagine that some of the ideas has sort of been shifted to the sidelines as everything in society turns more authoritative. But now it's coming back. And that's very important to remember with this series, that it's that the science fiction element of a totalitarian state and all the technology and things like that is mostly a backdrop to discuss political issues of today. There. The aesthetic itself is pretty much based on a sort of black bloc aesthetic, I suppose you could call it, or a protest aesthetic. It's not only black bloc, but when it was created, it was mostly the protests in Genoa, in Gothenburg, in Seattle, and so on. But now, when these images reappear again, it comes from Brazil, it comes from the Arab Spring, it comes from America, it comes from basically everywhere. So it's still relevant in that sense. And the political messages that are being discussed are also being touched upon by actual quotes and text material from writers like Judith Butler and Donna Haraway, which is being collaged into the text and into the artwork. Which creates a sort of mix of real-world politics, such as anarchism or resistance to corporate power and so on, with the identity politics that also needs to be discussed within a digital framework. Sort of, when we exist in a digital world, how do we relate to our individuality? We use phrases everywhere, and that is addressed also in the series, with a also quite literal take on copy and paste. Because the technology is of course exaggerated, and you're, for example, physically able to project yourself onto the internet, and then there are some problems with that, so you can actually accidentally be copied. And the aesthetics of the technology is also like quite anachronistic mix of high tech, which with internet and memetics and stuff, and technology that feels quite anachronistic, big machines and things like that. There aren't many guns, for example, in this work at all. Gun violence is treated as something quite spectacular, which also sets it apart from a lot of the American counterparts. For example, Lisa Seaman, they are brainwashing a worker back into the system. And for example, the Piracy floppy disks, and Matthias has told me that the purpose with treating technology in this way is to make it non-time specific. Sort of like steampunk genre, but without any Victorian elements. When I was considering this series, and especially the part with information, I think we have to address the fact that the way we view information now has changed in the last decade or so. Because information wants to be free, and also knowledge is power. Those two idioms have become sort of problematic. Now that we have easy access to all kinds of information, we can easily see what's happening in London or in Egypt or in basically anywhere where people can stream images, but still that doesn't automatically solve any of the problems, which leads to the conclusion that information wants to be free and knowledge is power, but power that is useless unless it's contextualized as some form of resistance. I think Matthias said that only information is only dangerous if it leads to new ideas, and new ideas are only dangerous if it leads to action. Basically, because as a drawback, as we have become kind of saturated with information every day, is that people no longer react as heavily to the report. Now everybody knows that the police everywhere, not only in dictatorships, but also in democracies, brutalize people, and that people are being jailed with draconian times for small petty crimes in a riot situation and so on, and that is not, but still it just goes on. So that is a problem to be considered. Another thing in this series is as it is a fictional political work, it still takes some liberties with representation, as it introduces metaphysical concepts of meta-magic. And meta-magic is another take on reality hacking. Matthias splits the two lines that the heroes of the book try to change the status quo or fight the status quo into hackers and meta-magicians. And hackers are basically hackers, and meta-magicians treat language, the language of reality. They see the world in code, and they can change that code. And this image is a good representation of the visualization of the digital worlds, and it has also a lot of matrix references in a way. Now, the ideas being presented in the book about mass and protest is very much based on the concept that only mass action can affect the outcome of things. Which means the book has heroes, it has identifiable characters which you follow, but they are not the real motivating force behind the story, because in the end, these characters are only individuals. They can fight against this evil empire, but it's the mass itself that is possible of actually being a catalyst for change. And this scene is from one of the protest/riot scenes in the book. And these kind of references to reclaim the streets and so on, there are a lot of them. And now, a substantial part of the books is about these kind of situations, and I think that anyone who has ever been in a protest situation which has been turning violent would be able to relate to the images of these policemen charging, for example. I mean, have you ever been dodging a policeman's club? You kind of understand the situation. It has to be said that this book does not really try to be objective. It has a clearly subjective view of what is the force of good and what is the force of evil. Though it's in every separate issue it goes into investigating the mindset of the people working as police, enforcing this oppressive regime and so on. So it's not entirely black and white, only that it has a very clear moral standpoint. And the scene, as I said, the scenes of policemen charging through tear gas has become pretty relevant again. And I mean, it's an entirely separate discussion to discuss what kind of means are justified and so on. Basically, this image sort of sums up a lot of the ideology behind the book. All human societies, all the great empires have been built upon blood. So it's a basically anarchist criticism of power. And what Matthias does in this book is that he shifts the discussion of power and ideology and the psychology behind mass control into a metaphysical representation, which is a sort of almost Lovecraftian element. There are gods, sort of like these demonic monstrous creatures, which are somehow existing above the totalitarian order. And these gods, I think they shouldn't be taken that literal. I think they are meant to be read as representations of the nastier parts of civilization. Slavery and war and so on. And somehow one of these gods have survived and is now acting as existing on top of the oppressive regime and demanding sacrifice in the form of workers and slaves who are just being systematically grinded into the machine. This is also quite literally discussed in book number 9, Deicide, where a god is actually killed. So, and I think that the metaphor there could be read as a god doesn't need to exist in the real world. It's not really relevant whether God exists. The important thing is that God does exist in a way because of institutions, because of morality, because of like this sense, this common sense of order in the universe, and that killing God is killing a metaphorical concept of oppression. Oh no, back there. Yeah, I have an exact quote here from Matthias, which is, "The question of God's actual existence is irrelevant, since the reality is that God is there, in our collective consciousness with nowhere else." There are a lot of other political and theoretical issues being touched upon, and it's a lot of them, so I won't be able to go into them in detail. But, for example, when we talked about it, he said that he has considered the issue of, for example, feminism as important, and that he considered whether making some sort of feminist statement or trying to work with the setting itself. And apparently he tried to create a world where the gender aspect had been obliterated by the extinction of history and the extinction of individuality, sort of, like, meaning there are no men or women anymore, there are only slaves to the system. Whether this is a good strategy or not is also an interesting, a separate discussion that will go on forever. But it's a tactic of this, so it has been addressed in some way. Which also links back to the Judith Butler and Donna Haraway references. Now, the enemy, because there is a really clear point of view of what is the enemy. It's like the concept of religion, the concept of capitalism, corporations, police, the state, and everything. It's being addressed in a way that is both black and white, but also a little more nuanced. For example, there is no doubt that anyone upholding the order is evil, but he still tries to go into the details and discuss why these people don't understand what they're doing, or why they have a completely different view. So one should keep that in mind. That this is a biased comic. Also, it's the political perspective of the book is very now. It deals with the issues and topics that we are discussing now in the world. It's like corporate greed, also the death of ideology following the end of the Cold War. What happens when one set of beliefs and one ideology claims to be the only one still existing in the world? And the logical conclusion of that is that if people have decided to treat market as a religion into itself, it will actually become religion at some point. And he also touches in later volumes. He touches upon the idea of democracy and how the status quo is using democracy to demobilize any kind of resistance, sort of saying, here you have a vote, now you don't need to complain. You can vote for the conservatives who want death squads, or you can vote for the progressives who don't want death squads, but they think that everyone still should remain slaves, or you can vote for the fascists who want sweep the streets clean from any kind of opposition. That is a quite simple power dynamic yet again. If you take, I don't know if anyone here has read The Invisibles by Grant Morrison. Yeah. Again, that, or watch The Matrix. Both of those series and films work in a more like, in a way which is far from dualistic, while Matthias is much more working within the frame good versus evil. And I think that is one of the points, one of the important points of this book, and why I think it's set in a dystopic setting, in a world which is kind of like our own, but also very crude and extreme, like an exaggerated version. I mean, we can project ourselves into the internet, unfortunately. And but basically, I think it's a utopian comic. I think it's not a dystopian comic because it works with this dualistic good versus evil thing, and you all, even if they have their setbacks, you get the feeling that somehow good will prevail. Which is a far more positive approach than a lot of cyberpunk, in which corporations just happen to be there, and they're too powerful, and the individual have no, they have their individual adventures, but basically the status quo remains the same. And I know that upcoming issues will be discussing concepts such as revolution and evolution, but they haven't been published yet, so it's hard for me to talk about it. This is basically the framework of this series, and I'm thinking if there's anything that we could be, is there any questions or anything that we should discuss more?
Is it available through internet? Do I have to buy it or something?
Oh yeah, actually you can buy the comic from Matthias if you're interested in reading it. He published it himself, and it's quite cheap. And it's also a good comic, and you get it collected in 2 fat volumes now. It used to be published in smaller, thin books, but now he smashed them all together into 2 big books. Or, as he says himself, you can also, if you find it, download it. It's completely okay. And if you happen to buy it and you have the energy to upload it, it's also quite okay. It's a very pro-piracy ideology behind his own publishing.
But it's not freely licensed, so you have to break the law.
Yeah. But it's copyrighted, but I know that Matthias only copyrighted it so that it couldn't be used for commercial gain by anyone without his permission. So feel free to download it if you find it, or buy it. Anyway, the information, the debates about information and also about subversion and so on in the story is a really important issue, I think. Yes.
Why doesn't he license himself from Creative Commons so we can legally share it and he can make money and they can have a donate us? Because there's a point in making people break the law to share it. We shouldn't have too much respect for the laws.
Yeah.
And I put up the first 2 chapters are on the Pirate Bay that I put up myself. I was just too lazy to do the rest. So if anyone else does it, it would be nice.
Yeah, you still have to work a little bit. But that is the thing about this series also. It's like the good guys are the anarchists, basically. They are. Oh, I forgot to talk about television. television plays a big role in this book as the main technology of propaganda and control, and that is also goes way back. I mean to 1984, for example. But it's in this case it's taken to such extremes that the anarchists managed to shut down television in a zone, creating a TV-free zone, which eventually leads to complete riots because the police have to evict everyone living in a dead zone, because the whole propaganda machine won't work if you cannot project propaganda onto the TV. And basically when they start evicting people start fighting back, which is it's already in the beginning of the second book or something. So that concept of resistance is there from the beginning. And as I said earlier, the problems with technology and information, that is a real challenge if you want to actually challenge the status quo, because how do you transform your ideas into action because we always imagine sort of like if everyone could just see what is happening, they would have to stop. But now we come to like a point where everything has become very cynical. If we take like the Arab Spring, for example, when we saw pictures of policemen beating people up and everyone was screaming, this is happening in a dictatorship, this is unacceptable, and then it happened, say in New York, with Occupy Wall Street, and or everywhere in other places where you see police pepper spraying people and so on. And then all they did was like deny, no, this is a democracy, things like this doesn't happen, and then the images don't mean anything all of a sudden. And that I think is a really important question. How do you overcome the saturation of information? How do you keep yourself informed without actually losing the desire to change things? How do you resist that? I mean, there is only so much misery a person can watch before they become desensitized. I'm not sure if this comic book answers that question though. Or what would you say?
Maybe it was because the information is so controlled that my point in the story, when some piece of information gets out and makes people react, it works only because the information is so controlled that it's new when it happens.
Which is sort of the counterpoint to what's happening now.
Yeah.
Where we're almost drowned in a flood of information, which becomes sort of meaningless in a way because we cannot filter it properly.
You'll also be here with the stand tomorrow?
Yeah. Not in the evening, but during the day.
Let's see if there's something else I forgot to mention. Yeah, also the idea of magic, because magic is very real in the context of the comics, and that is also, I think, metaphorical. So it's not about magic, it's about language and control, and the idea that if you control a subvert language, you control reality, which is also a very valid point. And this is of course quite classic territory for a lot of counterculture underground culture makers, writers like William S. Burroughs or Alan Moore have been into this idea for decades. But magic is a language, and language is sort of what the world is constructed of. Well, is there any more questions?